turn to Isaiah chapter 64. Very familiar verses. Isaiah 64, verses 1 and 2. Oh, that thou wouldst rend the heavens, that thou wouldst come down, that the mountains might flow down at thy presence. As when the melting fire burneth, the fire causeth the waters to boil, to make thy name known to thine adversaries, that the nations may tremble at thy presence. What we read here is a portion of a prayer. The prayer is recorded, Isaiah 63, verse 15, through the end of Isaiah 64. It is the prayer and heart cry of Isaiah, a real man, not some mythical character. It is a prayer that reveals the heart, the desire, the yearning, the burden, and the passion of this man, Isaiah. Isaiah, of course, lived faithfully, served God during an extremely trying and difficult time, a very dangerous and challenging time. And yet he did not conform to the thinking, to the reasoning, to the methods, to the ways of his times. He did not succumb to the spiritual emptiness that was in God's people. He did not succumb to the defeat and the bondage and the chaos and the dysfunction that God's people were in. But he remained faithful to God. He maintained a belief in God, a belief in God's Word. He had seen, he had felt, he had experienced God's glory, His grace, His mercy. He had a vivid realization of God. And he viewed God as the only hope of man. We want to speak this afternoon on seeking an obvious manifestation of God. In the first message, we saw the desire for a manifestation of God. Here we see the prayer for a manifestation of God. We want to view the prayer in light of, first of all, Isaiah's time, the days in which he lived. And we'll just refer to several things quickly. But in chapter 1 and verse 2, we hear the Lord say, speaking to His people, I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me. So it was a time when the masses lived in rebellion against God. Chapter 1, verse 3, we see that God's people did not understand and did not acknowledge God. Chapter 1, verse 4, they are a people laden with iniquity. They were weighted down with sin. It was affecting their lives. Also in chapter 1, verse 4, they are a seed of evildoers. Evil was spreading. Evil was progressing through their generations. There's a message there. Also in chapter 1, verse 4, children that are corrupters. They have forsaken the Lord. They have provoked the Holy One of Israel in anger. They are gone away backward. So it was a time of corruption. It was a time when the Lord was being renounced. It was a time of provocation. It was a departure from God. Chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, it was a time when God's people were in a very hurting condition. One of failing spiritual health. One of spiritual weakness. From chapter 1, verse 7, it was a time of desolation and defeat. From chapter 1, verse 8, it was a time of spiritual poverty and misery. Chapter 1, verse 9, we read, except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant. So it was a time when there were very, very few who had any real interest in the Lord. From verses 11 through 15 of chapter 1, it was a time of empty worship and formalism. And read those verses and see what God thinks about it. Chapter 2, verse 6. The land was full of soothsayers. People who spoke without any inspiration of God. People who spoke a message that was void of God. Chapter 2, verse 6. They pleased themselves in the children of strangers. That is, they contented themselves in the customs of the enemies of God. Chapter 2, verse 7, it was a time of great materialism. And in verse 8, we read that their land is full of idols. In chapter 3, verse 12, we read, for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. God's order was forsaken. Children were oppressing the adults, and women were in authority. And notice, O my people which rule over thee. Who is it? The children and the women. Cause thee to err and destroy the way of thy paths. They had rejected God's order. Chapter 5, verse 2, we read of wild grapes. As the land was full of poison, and that which was useless. In chapter 5, verse 5, we learn that the hedges of God's protection were being removed, thus exposing them to every variety and increase of sin and danger. In chapter 5, verse 8, we see that their selfishness, their covetousness, and materialism, they were rampant. The masses were influenced and governed and driven and shaped by the temporary. From chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, we see that the masses were in a state of frenzy. They were out of their minds for sinful pleasure. We read in verse 18 of chapter 5, woe unto them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity, and sin as it were a cart rope. They were openly and blatantly living in sin. We read in chapter 5, verse 20, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil, and put darkness for light and light for darkness, and put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. They perverted truth. They believed error to be truth, and truth to be error. They were twisted in their judgment. In verse 21 of chapter 5, woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes. They're twisted in their judgment and they think they're smarter than everyone else. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Their attitude was, man is the center of the universe. There's nothing bigger, there's nothing greater than man. From chapter 5, verse 22, the government was wicked. And in verse 24 of chapter 5, they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. That's a wicked government. The masses rejected and thought lightly of the Word of God. From chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, the condition of the masses were that they did not understand spiritual matters, and it didn't bother them. And they were hard, they were obstinate, they were unteachable. In Isaiah 30, verse 1, Woe to the rebellious children, saith the Lord, that take counsel, but not of me, that they may add sin to sin. The reason they didn't take counsel of God is because they knew what God would say. And they wanted to add sin to sin. You have the progression of sin. So the masses rejected and thought lightly the Word of God. In Isaiah 31, verse 1, Woe unto them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay in horses and trust in chariots, because they are many. The masses were looking to the world for what they needed, and they neglected God. In Isaiah 35:1, there is the word picture of a sad state of affairs. It mentions the wilderness, and the solitary place, and the desert. And this is descriptive of what Judah had become. It was also descriptive of their hearts and their lives. The wilderness speaks of uncivilized and aimless bewilderment, restlessness, unsettledness, discomfort, danger. The word solitary place speaks of loneliness. And the word desert conveys the idea of waste, barren, infertile, unfruitful, monotony of pathless sand. In Isaiah 35:7, we read of the parched ground, that which was withered and shriveled. We read of the thirsty land, that which is hard and unreceptive, a picture of suffering. And we read of the habitation of dragons, of harm and destruction. And all of this speaks of a situation and condition of great trouble and distress and misery and suffering and grief and pain and affliction due to sin. Also in Isaiah 35:3 and 4, we read of weak hands, decrepit hands, conveying the idea of they're unable to work and could hardly be lifted up in praise. They were feeble knees, unsteady, conveying the idea of an inability to bow before God, an inability to pray. Also, you see the word fearful. They were alarmed. They were in a state of panic, apprehensive and anxious, fearful heart. Isaiah 35 and verse 4, we see, or verse 5, they blind and deaf. That shows a defect in their perception. Isaiah 35:6, there's the lame, affecting the powers of motion and activity in spiritual matters, a disability to walk and run spiritually. They're also referred to as the dumb, an inability in speech, an incapacity of utterance. All of this is spiritual in nature, and is a result of sin, the result of a pursuit of vanity. Throughout the book, there's a very grim, dreadful, frightful, and miserable picture painted of their spiritual condition. It is a picture of an extremely needful and urgent situation. In Isaiah's prayer, if we go back to Isaiah 63, verse 17, the masses had rejected God by their idolatry and their wickedness. And they brought exile upon themselves. They brought this bondage that was coming, Babylonian captivity. They brought it upon themselves. God's people like to complain today about everything that's here and everything that's coming, but the truth is God's people have brought it upon themselves because they haven't been what they should be. Isaiah 64:6, we do all fade as a leaf, a picture of decay. And also our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away, a picture of instability. In verse 7, we see apathy and prayerlessness have prevailed, and that they were under the chastisement of God. In verses 10 and 11, notice, thy holy cities are a wilderness. Zion is a wilderness. Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and our beautiful house, where our fathers praised thee, is burned up with fire, and all our pleasant things are laid waste. Again, there was great ruin and great loss. All around us are ruins. All around us. In addition to all of these matters, reading through the prayer, we see that the Lord had withdrawn himself, which is Romans chapter 1. In Isaiah 63 verse 15, look down from heaven, and behold, from the habitation of thy holiness and of thy glory, where is thy zeal and thy strength, the sounding of thy bowels and thy mercies toward me? Are they restrained? And just on and on it goes. God had left the people and left them to judgment. Verse 7 of chapter 64, thou hast hid thy face from us. Hundreds of years, they move further and further from God. You do that for a couple hundred years, you're going to be a long ways away. And that's what happened. It's what we're witnessing ourselves. They dismiss him more and more from their thoughts and their lives. When you do that, you put other things in the place of God. And they busy themselves in other pursuits. And they place more and more esteem upon the earthly. And they become more and more desensitized to the things of God. That was the condition in Isaiah's day. Certainly we can identify. God's people had lost their spiritual appetite. And they were satisfied with mere lip service and half-hearted devotion. The world had engulfed the lives of God's people. And they were more moved by the thoughts of man, more influenced, more impacted by the thoughts and ways of man than thus saith the Lord. So it was a dire situation that Isaiah found himself in. It was an urgent time. But there's Isaiah. There's Isaiah. In the midst of it all, he is a man surrendered and committed to the Lord. He is a man available to the Lord. He possesses a spirit of readiness in the Lord's business. A man to whom the Lord was a priority. A man of love and devotion and passion and zeal and purpose for the Lord. So though Isaiah lived under the constant bombardment of the evil of his day and constantly exposed to such, he lived above it. God's people need to quit blaming the times for their spiritual failing health. and look at themselves. Because throughout history, there have been men and women who lived in terrible spiritual times, and they rose above it. And such was Isaiah. He refused to be shaped by what was all around him, and he focused upon God. Throughout the book, Isaiah presents God. Why? Because those are only hope. Those are only hope. It's the only hope for our society today. There is no other hope. Oh, if so-and-so gets elected, he'll fix it all. No, he won't. No, he won't. The only hope is God. And throughout the book, God is presented as accessible, as faithful, as glorious, as holy, as just, as kind, as loving, merciful, powerful, as righteous, true, unequaled, unsearchable, and the remedy for the needs of man, the remedy for the need of society. In Isaiah 57 and 15, God is seen as the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. Isaiah, in the midst of a dire and urgent situation, thought that God was who and what they needed. He believed that. He was fully persuaded of that. And that there was hope in God. And all through the book, Isaiah points to God as the only source of hope. Points to God as the only solution. From Isaiah chapter 35, Isaiah knew that God could bring gladness and fruitfulness and beauty and strength and steadiness and calmness and deliverance and ability and abundance. Isaiah knew. Isaiah knew that there was hope in the Lord. He knew that. And that's why he just kept on pointing people to the Lord. By the time you get to our text, Isaiah 64, things had grown progressively worse. But Isaiah is still standing. Isaiah seeing and feeling a great need for God, he prays. And there seems to be an increasing passion and fervency in his prayer. Notice in verse 15 of Isaiah 63, he prays, "Look down from heaven, and behold, from the habitation of thy holiness and of thy glory." So he prays, "Look down from heaven." But notice in our text, verse 1, the prayer grows in desire, in passion, in fervency. He's gone from look down to come down. So it is with you and I. As things continually get worse, and they're going to. That's what the Bible teaches. It's going to happen. Our fervency ought to be growing, not declining. If we are declining spiritually, we're part of the problem. We're not to be part of the problem. We're to be presenters of the remedy of the problem. So his desire has grown. And he says, come down. Come down. Oh, that thou wouldst come down. His desire is the same thing that David was desiring. Let God arise. That is, manifest himself. He's just looking at it a little different. Coming down. But it's the same thing. It's a manifestation of God. So Isaiah, burdened. We need to be careful. Yes, we are to be angry and sin not. And we are not to accept sin or any of that. We know that. But we need to be careful that we don't just have anger without burden. There has to be a burden. When you see all that's going on, does it just make you mad? Or is there a burden? Lord, come down! Because He's the only one who can fix it. There's a burden. He's passionately praying. I believe that before the Lord comes, that God's people will be pleading for God to return. Things will have gotten so bad that they're pleading. I believe God could come at any moment. The Bible teaches it. But I don't see anybody pleading for God's return. There's not a fervency. There's not a passion. If anything, God's people get colder and colder by the day. More and more into the world, day by day. We need to be Isaiah, passionately praying. In Isaiah 63:16, Isaiah recognizes God as Father and Redeemer. And from 64 verse 8, He's the potter. And in light of all this, Isaiah prays, oh, that Thou wouldst rend the heavens, that Thou wouldst come down. It's a pleading that God would do something. Now you think about that. We've preached on this passage before. Oh, that Thou wouldst rend the heavens. Just split them wide open. In an intention-getting way. That'll get your attention. That'll cause great alarm. He's praying for God's intervention in a spectacular, powerful, and undeniable way. That's what he's praying for. He's praying for a sudden bursting forth of God. For the visible presence of God. God coming down to visit His people and bless His people. He's praying for something that is absolutely breathtaking. An awe-inspiring manifestation of God's power, of God's goodness, of God's mercy, of God's glory, of God's judgment. Isaiah is praying that God would come down to where they are. In a time, verse 7, where there is none that calleth upon Thy name, that stirreth himself to take hold of Thee. There is Isaiah praying this prayer. A disrupting display of God. A dramatic show of the power of the Lord on their behalf. You ever think about how dramatic the Lord is? Read the miraculous accounts throughout, especially the Old Testament. God did things in a very dramatic way. I mean, it couldn't be denied. The Red Sea, on and on we could go. Oh, that God would come down in a dramatic way. He says that the mountains might flow down at thy presence. Just the very presence of God would just cause the mountains to flow down. That's a very dramatic presentation of God. That'll get your attention. It is a prayer for God to upend lives, to remove the mountains, to remove the distance between us and God. Do we want God to remove the distance between us and God? I'm afraid many would, if they were honest, would have to say, I'm happy the way it is. How sad. That God would remove the coldness, and the apathy, and the emptiness, and the weariness, and the worldly mindedness, the prayerlessness, the waywardness, the pride, the ingratitude, the spiritual instability, the hypocrisy that's been going on so long that people don't even realize it's hypocrisy. And bring about spiritual desire and spiritual excitement and passion and zeal. Oh, that God would rend the heavens, cause the mountains to flow down at His presence. It is a prayer for reviving. It is a prayer for reviving. Longing for the reviving presence of God. And He saw the need of such. More importantly, He felt the need of such. And there He is, praying. Praying that God would display Himself. That God would make Himself known in a life-impacting, life-altering way. And though the masses were taken up in the temporal and the material and in the secular, Isaiah, that's not where his mind is. His mind is upon the spiritual, upon the eternal. That which pertains to godliness and spiritual living. Matters that relate to the soul. And man's relationship with God. And he pleaded with God. That God would come down. Manifest Himself. Isaiah is desperate for God. That's what we need. It's seriously lacking today. We need to be a people desperate for God. I mean, you look at the nation, the world, the times, the people, the trends, the circumstances, just of your inner circle, and it's pitiful. You look at it nationwide, it's pitiful. And then you get some person who says, well, I don't think it's all that bad. Yeah, you're a pig in the filth. Just like that. You don't see anything wrong with it. Part of the problem. But we again, it ought to burden us. Burden us enough to be concerned about our own spiritual condition. And we're not sliding backward, but that we're moving closer and closer to God. That God would manifest Himself. God can. God can. I believe that with all my heart. God can. And He's greater than all the needs and all that stands in the way. And we need to plead that He would come down where we are in a very manifest way that would change our lives, that would upend our lives and cause us to be what we need to be. Cause us to be what we need to be. Preached a message, I believe it was last year, may have been the year before. God's people not ready. And it's true. The day of birth has come and my people are not ready to bring forth. That's true. That which is coming, God's people aren't ready for. And what's sadder yet is they don't care. They really don't. Well, oh well, Lord's coming back. We better get ready. And the only way to be ready is to draw closer and closer and closer to the Lord every single day. Every single day. Because just Isaiah lived in times, they were under the judgment of God, and more severe judgment was coming in the form of Babylonian captivity. Here we are. We as a nation, a society, a people, under the judgment of God. And more severe judgment is coming. And God's people are to be burdened about that. Enough to plead with God. Now you have churches. They cancel Wednesday evening services. Make their services shorter. I ought to be making them longer. That's not that there ever was a time, but this certainly isn't the time to cut back. It's not the time. We need to have a burden. A burden for the lost all around us. Realize that God's the only one that can fix their lives, save their lives, and point them to the one who can. That's what we ought to be doing. And it ought to burden our soul. We are to stand against the sins of the times. We have to. You have to. Well, that's going to make them mad. Yes, it will. But you have to. But all the time you point them to the solution. Their only hope is God. Brother Dave, if you'll come and lead us